Okay, it looks like we are live and streaming. So, we are here today with Interim Director Robert Spahr. This is an episode of Nonfiction Narrative Discourses, aka Beyond the Bio. Director Spahr, the point of this project is to take information from the SIU website or your personal website and the bio that is written there and kind of go beyond that, get a little more in depth, let people get to know you a little bit better, what you do, where your interests lie, that sort of thing. The main questions that I personally want to go over is where are you from? Why or how did you get to SIU? And why do you teach what you teach?
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here with you and talk about this stuff. I grew up in Southern Ohio, out in the middle of nowhere outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. My big move to a city was moving there for college. I went to a really small art school, the Cincinnati Art Academy. Studied all kinds of fine art stuff. It was the beginning of my journey. It was a great little pretty exciting experimental little place in a pretty conservative city. So it was really refreshing for me as 18-year-old right out of high school. And I traveled a bit for a year after that in Europe and went to grad school. So I landed in New York City, went to Parsons School of Design for my graduate degree, stayed there for about 20 years doing all kinds of fun stuff, which we can talk about. And then ultimately started teaching. I went to grad school pretty young, right after a year after college, but I didn't teach for another 15 years later. So I did all kinds of things working as an artist, and then started teaching adjunct work all over Philadelphia, Long Island, Connecticut, a little bit in New York, and then came directly here to SIU a few years later in the tenure track position and right in the Department of Cinema and Photography.
Okay, so what was your main, when you were, let's see, so your undergrad, what was your undergrad degree in?
It's a fine art degree. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts. I concentrated in sculpture, but lots of drawing, printmaking, painting, and sculpture, general fine art kind of thing. But I did concentrate on object making. Same for grad school, same idea.
Okay.
I basically, in grad school, I produced objects in this kind of post-minimalist fashion, if you were to imagine kind of what I was doing. And really the big turning point, there's sort of two theoretical turning points in my life where books and reading theory really fundamentally altered the course of my trajectory. And having graduated with an MFA in sculpture from Parsons School of Design, it was a recession in the early to mid 90s in New York. And so you have to kind of I had to make a lot of things happen for myself. So I started a gallery space. I was hanging around with a lot of theater people that I knew. And they had a theater, and every night crowds would come in, and it was an empty lobby, and we turned it into an alternative gallery on the Lower East Side of Manhattan.
Neat.
And that's really one of the things I started doing. And as I was sitting during gallery hours one day, because it was open one day a week as a gallery, I was reading a film theory book. And I happened to read Walter Benjamin's essay from 1936, The Work of Art in the Age of Technological Reproduction.
Wow.
And my whole head exploded. He wrote this book sort of fleeing the Nazis, but trying to make sense of photography and cinema and how that altered our view of all art history, the fact that it's reproducible. It's a more complicated essay than that, but that idea, the idea of mechanical or technological reproduction in our relationship to the original object and how that's changed really affected me fundamentally. And I, in theory, in my mind, hyperbolically stopped making objects.
Huh.
I didn't really. I started doing performance and making objects through the act of doing performance in front of an audience. So it became very process oriented that resulted in an object. I then did a lot of theater work, which we could talk about, in film work with the actors. I started a theater company not long after hanging around with the actors. I started doing a lot of performance art. We did original Shakespeare, experimental Shakespeare outside on the Lower East Side. There was an empty parking lot, and I rented a theater, a little storefront space across from this empty parking lot. And we turned that space into a theater. and the city got permission to produce outdoor theater in the summer. So we did free Shakespeare in the parking lot as a take on Shakespeare in the Park.
Interesting. So, what kinds of crowds were you drawing for that?
Well, believe it or not, the New York Times came down and reviewed us, or we would have not survived the winter. But because of the review, we would get about 100 people a night.
That's not bad.
Yeah, for what we were doing, that was great. It's about all we could hold, actually. Anything more than that, you couldn't hear the play. That was about our max. But yeah, we would do 100 people a night all summer long on average. And we started as the theater company that did free Shakespeare, and we also did some original plays inside. And we ended by saying, oh, they do these amazing, we ended up doing a festival of 94 original plays every summer over the 94 days of summer.
Wow.
And so had a writers group, and we turned some of those into films and did a lot of great, it was just an array, really for me personally, it was this like magical moment of creative a community that we created on the Lower East Side that only existed for maybe 5 years, but it was this really amazing thing. And everything I do today, I kind of look back at the kernel of the idea comes from that period of time. When that ended, I jumped on we needed a website back then. The web was really new, and we started streaming video, and I created the website. So basically, when my theater kind of ended that period of time, I jumped on sort of the .com bandwagon before the crash.
Sure.
That became my day job. I kept making my own work, but my technological skills increased during that time of working in the .com era. So I added those technical skills to all of my past, and the kind of work I've been doing just not long after 9/11, somewhere around 2003 is when it really kicked in. I write really simple little computer scripts and programs that scrape the web for content. And depending on the sites that I target, whether I started with news sites or social media sites, it basically pulls the content down based on the algorithms and recombines them into a form of collage, either video, still image, sometimes it's text-based. And this work is automated. And again, the second I mentioned, my first moment was Walter Benjamin. The second was around 2001. Lev Manovich, the media scholar, published this book called The Language of New Media. And I read chapter 1, and literally, much like Walter Benjamin, I put the book down. I couldn't finish the book. The first chapter made my head, again, just sort of explode to some extent. And he was really looking at cinema history and the language of cinema and saying, what does the world of digital media, how is it different? How is it related to the language of cinema? And he lays this out, and he really has sort of 5 really simple principles. I'll mention them very quickly.
Sure.
So the first thing is, when it's digital, if once a piece of media is digital and made up of zeros and ones, it's inherently modular. It's made up of parts. And when it's made up of parts, it can be variable. So you could have a Photoshop file of different layers, and it can move and change. When it's variable, it can become automated. So the New York Times homepage tomorrow is going to be completely different than it is today. Different images, different text, but we still consider it the New York Times homepage. And because of that, it can change. The images can be sitting on different servers, but we still think of it as one media object made up of parts. And the last principle is transcoding, that things can be transcoded simply from, let's say, a WAV file to an MP3 file.
Okay.
But the idea of that variability, and back to the reproducibility of Walter Benjamin, just hit me at the right time in my life. So I started coding these automated collages, and I've been doing that since for about 17 years. I have one that I've been running every hour since about June of 2003, and it's producing an image every hour, on the hour, as long as I have internet connection. So the idea of thousands of images, what we all experience every day now of like computer data overload on our news feeds, is one of the things I'm really interested in. The idea that script runs almost like a theatrical script, where we have one production of Macbeth and another production of Macbeth, but it's still Shakespeare. Or in a conceptual art sense or a music sense, you might have a score, and a different composer, a different performer would perform that script or that performance, and yet it's still the author. Who is the author? And in conversation with the internet. The other kind of thread of my artistic practice besides this coding is a much slower traditional kind of art making, where I'll select a digital image, let's say, that the script has created, and I usually work it digitally a little bit, blow it up really large in like a Xerox architectural drawing kind of mechanical reproduction, and then draw and paint on that and with much more traditional materials. So it's really a painting or a multimedia something. But it's a much slower process. So there's this fast process in conversation with the internet, with overload, and then another process that's much more mindful and slow looking, slow thinking. And that's kind of how all of my work sort of fits kind of in one of those two categories.
So when you're creating the images and you've got these what you call cruft images and cruft videos, how are you displaying those as an artist?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll mention is cruft is an interesting term I chose carefully because if anyone's familiar, it's the slang term. It's a derogatory term for really bad code. It's like leftover code that's not really being used, almost like an appendix, a software appendix, or residue. It's what's no longer being used, but it's still there. It's bloat, but you ignore it.
Okay.
And to me, a digital image on CNN that's important today becomes cruft tomorrow. It disappears, but it sits somewhere and it's no longer useful, but it almost disappears.
Right.
And so this cruft process captures these images and saves them, but also produces thousands of images that I haven't seen. I've displayed them over the years in many different ways. A lot of times they're web-based in the sense that mostly you view them over a browser on a screen electronically, whether it's a phone or a laptop. I've presented them in galleries and festivals, either as a slideshow projected. I've printed them out, inkjet prints in more of a traditional kind of photography sense at a high res on archival paper. None of those ways seem really satisfying to me. I think really the way they exist is on the web for the day that they're there or the hour that they're there, and then they get replaced. It seems much more true to a late capitalistic period of time that these things are practically disposable rather than becoming archival on paper in a museum.
Right, and I almost wondered if you considered the presentation of them as part of the art.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, because I guess it seems like it's kind of more of an integrated art experience rather than just a singular piece.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great comment, really, because in many ways, that's what one of the questions that I think, or I hope the work asks all of us and myself, I think about, is where is the art? Is it the computer code instructions, like a recipe, and then you go into my website and you see a particular snapshot at that moment, the residue of that code running in collaboration with the internet, and you come tomorrow or at another moment, it'll be a totally different image, but it's the same code. And so where is the art experience? Is it the archive that I used to have the entire archive on my website? It became so huge. It's about 80 gigs of content, and I just took it off because it's just cumbersome.
I can imagine. I was actually going to ask about that. Where are you housing all of this?
Yeah, they're all on servers. I don't make that part public anymore. Sometimes people would drill down into them, but it's overwhelming. It's thousands of stuff. So in many ways, is that just the residue and the art is the idea? Is it for example, when I first started in 2003, it was right when we were invading Afghanistan and Iraq and all of that stuff was beginning. You could really tell many of the images of the news was that story in the news. The last 4 or 5 years ago when Trump was president, all of my work became about Trump if it was work dealing with the news because he dominated the news cycle.
Sure.
And so I sort of you can sort of see the arc of that narrative in the archive, which is different than seeing one particular snapshot. So I don't have an answer. I would say all of it is the art for me.
Okay.
But my part of the project is writing that code and letting it and starting the process, and then that process being automated is my collaboration with the internet as a giant database. I mean, that interests me a lot.
So I'd like to know a little bit about how you learned about coding, kind of the technology aspect of things. Like, what do you think was fundamental to you being able to learn that side of things? Because I would imagine, I mean, was any of your college career even focused at all on technology, or this was all on your own?
Not so much.
Yeah.
No, this is all on my own. Yeah, when I like to tell students here at SIU, when I was even in grad school, the job that I did I did much work, web development, web designer, project manager, all that stuff. None of that was really invented when I was even in school.
Right.
And I think what served me well as a job and an applied way of doing those skills, and then in my own art practice, the important skills that I learned probably undergrad more than even grad school is just my creative process was developed. My critical thinking was developed during my studies. The ability to keep learning, the skills to always be learning, whether it was more traditional things or digital. And then ultimately, those design skills and communication skills to tell stories, to communicate what others need to, when I worked in a more applied way of communicating what that client or what the company I worked for needed to communicate. Those skills served me well in that transition. But the technical skills happened in the late 90s. I started, and it happened from a much more political way. I was interested in Linux as an operating system. I started using Linux, an open source software, back in about 1998. And I would dual boot my Mac computer, and then about a year later, I basically have been using that as my primary operating system. Okay. And my interest in that is political, more because back then the technology was much rougher than it is today. Today it's pretty sophisticated. But politically, the idea that no corporation owned it, that this collaboration of software developers created it. And because of that, I worked on my web design and development, but I also was interested in software as this collaborative, really it's more free software, free as in freedom, that I'm really interested in. And over the years, I really just picked it up. And the way I have taught myself is when I need to do a solution, I try to find it. And again, in that free and open source software kind of way, a lot of it's already been written. You just kind of bolt together code that other people have written, or you can tweak it, and I can connect a lot of things. Just to give you an example, there's a program called Image Magic that's a free and open source software. It's really like Photoshop, but it's a command line program that you write the commands to this program, and it does in a simple way, but much of what Photoshop can do. So I really just connect bits of software together with scripts and a little bit of Python here and there, and it just kind of does what I need it to do. A real computer science person would joke and think that it's quite silly, and somebody who doesn't know technology might think it feels like magic, but it's really just simple technology as a tool to just, I try to do that in my classes, that it's just another tool. It's like understanding the physicality of charcoal if you're doing a drawing, and it's velvety and it's powdery and it can do a dark line and a light line, and it has a vocabulary. Well, the software does the same thing. It can become brittle and break. It can be flexible if written well, and it has its own physical. It isn't physical, but it has its own nature. And I try to think of it very much like that, where I am in conversation with that material.
So you have said, you've given us a couple examples of writers and books that influenced you. Was there specific artwork that influenced the artwork that you're doing digitally?
Absolutely, sure. It changes over time, but some of the big ones would be, let's say, the Dadaist between World War I and World War II. I think I'm a Dadaist at heart, maybe a little surrealism, but that sort of there's a little anger in there, in the sense that a lot of my work, I think I wish I was the kind of artist that would go find a landscape or a still life. I'm sorry, a sunset, and want to just do a beautiful sunset. But I tend to make work that comes from my frustrations. When you look at the work, it's usually like the world isn't the way I want it to be, and that's the impulse to make the work. So I really do feel an affinity to the Dadaist. Also, happenings and Fluxus artists in New York in the 60s, process-based art of the 70s, a lot of visual art. There's a whole thread of conceptual art, early computer art. Jack Burnham wrote about systems art in the late 60s, early 70s. Really famous show called The Software Show, where the first time computer scientists and artists were showing together. Experiments in art and technology is another big movement in the late 60s in New York, with Bell Telephone engineers and artists like Robert Rauschenberg working together. That sort of art and technology combo. Yeah. Those all I find really inspiring. David Lynch as a filmmaker, I think is amazing. I love how he started his career as a painter. He works from images. When he talks about his work, he thinks of fragments of images. He turns it into a script, which then becomes a film of images. I think he's very inspiring for me, just in the quality of his work and the range of his work. As a contemporary kind of media artist who started as a painter and known as a filmmaker.
Well, speaking of which, do you do anything with theater anymore? I mean, it sounds like theater was kind of part of your career for a while.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think in the same way that I think of myself in the heart still as a sculptor, I don't always make objects these days. Theater's a collaborative art that takes money and to produce and to do kind of large scale things. I do performances still. I didn't mention that. I do more performance art with the code. I'll present usually in collaboration with the computer and the internet. Occasionally I'll do it with a few other collaborators. I have over the last 10 years, let's say. It's a form of theater, but it isn't that traditional theater that I was doing, 20 years ago.
Sure.
But a lot of it depends on the facilities that you have and what you want to express. So I don't feel like it's ended. I just stopped for a while, and when the opportunity ever hits, I'll still make an object. I'll still do theater.
Yeah, I noticed that you had some kind of performance art pieces on your website.
Yes.
How often do you get to do performance art?
I do it a lot. There's a conference that I go to pretty regularly, even before I came to SIU, called the Generative Art Conference. It takes place in Italy. And what's awesome about that conference, I absolutely love it. You can go to generativeart.com is the website. And it's a very Italian looking website. So you'll have to, it looks very retro. But what's awesome about the conference is they're very open. It started with two architects in Milan at the Polytechnic there. He does software-based architecture, generative architectural design using code. And they started a conference, and they're very open to people from many different disciplines to push what does it even mean to make art that's generative. And what I love about that is they always have evenings of performance. So one of the places I've regularly performed is I usually present a paper and show art and so forth every year, and then I take part in that evening of performance. But I've done stuff as close, let's see, to Carbondale. I've done some stuff for some alums in Paducah, the Paducah School of Art down there. But mostly when I do performance, it's always either in New York or places in Italy. Before the pandemic, of course, I would go to those conferences regularly. The last year and this year, I'm presenting more over Zoom documentation of performance.
Gotcha. I'd kind of like to know, too, what your experience at Parsons was like. Parsons has a pretty good reputation. I'm sure there's there's some stories that you have as far as what your experience was at Parsons.
Oh, for sure. I loved it. I had a great experience. The thing that I think you have to remember if you're not familiar with New York is that the Parsons is part of the New School for Social Research. So it's kind of together, and the campus is in Greenwich Village. So really, the city becomes the campus. So it's that very much of an urban campus. When any urban campus where the city, me moving to New York and me going to grad school was intertwined. But I had a great experience. I had wonderful faculty. What was really good about it being in New York is we had regular faculty, but the kinds of visiting artists we could bring in very cheaply because they all just lived nearby and
they were all there. Yeah.
So the various people that I was able to meet was really wonderful. And the kind of guest speakers and lectures that you can get to remotely from Carbondale, but to be able to be there and have Q&A with some famous people was really great. I think my program at the time at Parsons, I don't know what it's exactly like now, that was quite a while ago, but was very object oriented in the sculpture department that I studied with. So people were making objects and thinking about the physicality of materials. And I think that thread falls through my work where I shift from medium to medium. I think of computer code as just another medium, even though doesn't have that physicality. So in that sense, I think what they really allowed at Parsons when I was there was that it was less about becoming a faculty member somewhere with your terminal degree, but how to develop the habits of a working professional artist, how to get the work made, how to sustain that practice. And I think it served me well because 30 years later, I have 30 years of consistently working. Now, maybe, the work is up and down based on all kinds of things in one's life, and I wouldn't say everything is equal, but my practice has stayed consistent, and I really attributed that to my grad school experience.
And that experience has to be vastly different from your experience here at SIU, just as far as the atmosphere, I would imagine. I don't necessarily mean the work that you're putting in, but just the atmosphere itself has got to be just completely different.
It's different in location and in energy, and clearly recently with the pandemic, that's a whole different thing. But just SIU in general. On the other hand, I think I'm at the perfect place because maybe not so much at the MFA level, but at the undergrad level, I think I can really relate. I'm sort of first generation. The art school that I went to going to college, my art school would take these trips every year, which I'd love for SIU to try to do more and more. But we would take a trip from Cincinnati. So I went to Chicago for the first time in my life in college.
Nice.
I went to Washington, D.C. for the first time in college. And my first trip to New York City was in college. And it was like those trips and the potential that it allowed me to see the world. I think that's what I can bring, and many faculty in the School of Media Arts have similar experiences to me, where they work in industry, they're artists and academics. So what I am describing to you is very common in the faculty of the School of Media Arts. I don't think I'm an anomaly at all in that sense.
Sure.
And I think what we bring is to students who are in Southern Illinois, like I was in Southern Ohio, and have not been exposed to these things. I think we bring that to the community within the school.
Of course.
And so in that sense, I think I'm in the perfect place.
So your actual work practices, are you consistently working on your generative art on a daily basis for a certain amount of time? Do you try and keep a schedule? Do you have goals in mind where you're trying to achieve X amount of images within a day, week, or month?
Yeah, I don't have I don't put those kind of pressures on myself, to be honest.
That's good.
I do try to work regularly, but I do not have a set schedule. I have found, at least in the last 5 to 10 years of my practice, what I tend to do is I have moments where I read a lot, or maybe in the summer I might be traveling more, and then my art production, I still consider that my practice, I'm not making things. It sort of marinates a while and ideas are forming. And then I'll have these bursts where I'll make a whole bunch of work in a month that's just an insane amount. And then I might go another month or two where I'm only just kind of working on one thing slowly. And so I am at the point where I no longer have like a fear, oh my God, will I stop working? I just try to go with the flow of where it's taking me, and to just trust that process. And I do think it's a certain amount of trust to wait until that idea or that moment hits. It's a fine line, of course, because then it can become procrastination too.
Sure, right.
So
now,
yeah.
Are you also at the same time, are you doing academic writing as well?
Yeah, I do a little bit. I don't know that an academic, I think the way I tend to think of my writing is I give context to the work.
Sure.
It's much closer to an artist writing about their work. I'm not doing scholarly research as much as framing my practice or talking about influences, writing and thinking about how a particular scholar might be thinking of something in relation to me as a maker. I'll write essays about creative process. I'm interested in that very much, and how we develop that and how it's different for everyone. Not to create a method to teach as much as how does that work and how do we facilitate that.
Yeah, I find your writing quite impressive, to be honest.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I actually got a lot out of it, and the image that you're seeing behind you, or in my background here, what I took just a short little clip of your writing: post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic growth, realignment. I really like that, just because the whole COVID thing kind of flipped everybody's world upside down, and there's a lot of people just kind of having a hard time, I think, readjusting. Everybody's talking about the new normal, that whole deal, and people are feeling very stressed about it. But it's very rare for anyone to say that this change may be an opportunity. It may be something interesting. It may, some good things may come of it. So I took that little bit of your writing, and I don't know if you're familiar with, there's an AI online called Night Cafe where you can put in a string of words and it will come up with an image. It just auto-generates an image. So this is the image that came up from that little piece of your writing.
Wow.
So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I thought that was kind of interesting, and it kind of goes along with what you're doing as far as auto-generated artwork.
I'm definitely confident that good things will come from these bad moments. I think that's why when I think of the Dadaist, or I think of the art of the 60s that I mentioned, those come from really similar times to now, the 20s, the 60s, and now. I find connections to those decades, either politically, the turmoil, not that it's exactly the same, but from those turmoils of between World War I and World War II. I have a much greater respect for the Dadaists after these last 2 years of the pandemic than I did before. I thought I understood what they went. I can't imagine what it was like after World War I.
Right.
And how the world must have felt like it came to an end.
Right.
But I have a better grasp and a better empathy for what I now understand those young people were going through.
Sure.
And so I do think I think it is, and I'm really hopeful that we don't go back to normal. I hope really good things do come from these moments. And I think the fact that so many people are giving up on their bullshit jobs is a sign that something has changed.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, things have undeniably changed. Yeah. I don't know that there's good. It's hard to say, but it doesn't seem like there's really going to be any going back to how things used to be. I mean, it's almost fundamental at this point. Right.
And my thought is, will it be what form of, hopefully some form of post-capitalism, something that breaks this sort of digital feudalism that we've almost shifted to feudalism in some ways, where everything we do gives Facebook and Google and Amazon more capital just by our use of the internet. You know, how do we resist that? And that goes back to free software and Linux and my interest in that politically. It's all interconnected, really. So I hope I'm of the age and the generation of the late 90s where the internet, the web in particular, was going to be this utopia of equity, and anyone can make a website and be equal to the corporations. And then, 25 years later, you see we're in this toxic mess. What I don't want to sound too much like a downer. One of the things that really concerns me right now is I was just talking about it earlier today. The internet doesn't have an off switch. Right. So we've created this thing that we're addicted to, the web and social media and the dopamine hits. And in many ways, it has the potential to make the world better. And it does for many of us. I love some of the things that it can do. Mm-hmm. But toxically, it's destroying democracy and all other kinds of relationships. And we can't turn it off.
Right.
With climate change, as much as we all want to fix it, I don't know that capitalism will allow us to stop the system. There is no switch.
Right.
And to me, those are the big issues of how do we make it a little better after the pandemic, but how do we fix all of these issues? And technology is so intertwined with it. The internet can bring us together at a distance and over time and compress time and all the wonderful things that it can do to communicate. And even during the pandemic, what it allows you and I to do right now over Zoom is pretty amazing.
Right.
But at the same time, we carry these devices in our pockets that track us and can listen to us and know exactly what we're doing. We willingly, this is the example I give a lot in class. I was in New York in 9/11, downtown, people covered in dust, and it was really a fairly traumatic moment for me in my life. It's a big moment. The idea that on September 10th, 2001, if I had said to you, if we were having this conversation, and I said, in the future, not only are we going to be tracked, we're going to pay at least $100 a month for the right to carry the tracking device.
Right.
And you're going to be addicted to it. And we won't be able to ever give it up. Right. And you're going to go to a website and tell everyone what you read and your religious beliefs and who your friends are. And you're going to do all of that willingly. You would have said I was crazy. It just wouldn't have been possible to imagine.
Yeah.
And yet, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that's something you also had written about, this kind of time warp that we're in terms of we're always kind of looking back. There's all these kind of retro reboots, and we're always kind of in the now, but we're never actually participating in it. We're just looking at it, and it's just kind of this strange kind of time limbo.
It is. It's our perception of time, right? The flattening of our feeling of time. So maybe the first 20 some years of the 21st century is really just all retro 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. Maybe the pandemic will break that cycle. That writing that you're referencing, I wrote, I think, June of the pandemic, after a few months of the pandemic. Some of the scholars that I would be referencing is Franco Biffo Berardi. The other book is, the author escapes me this second, Capitalist Realism.
Okay.
Anyway, those two, that book and the other writer, thinking about this idea that everything is kind of retro. The one example being, if you think of music. So for me, in my life, pre-web, a song really represents a particular year in my life, and I can really identify what it sounds like. If I said, what's the music of late 70s, you might say disco, Madonna or Michael Jackson in the 80s, Nirvana in the 90s. But then once you hit 2000s to 2010s, it starts to get a little fuzzy. Does that music sound like it's a different decade, or could it be from a different place? Mm-hmm. And again, clearly we're not stuck in a time warp, I don't believe. It's just the perception that things are not moving forward, that we watch everything as a retro box set. I think Blockbuster Video is a great example in the 90s. The idea that it becomes like a library. I don't have to watch prime time at 8 o'clock. I can go to Netflix and watch it anytime I want. If I said you can only Hemingway at 8 p.m., you'd say I'm crazy. I can go to the library and read it whenever. So in that sense, it's an improvement, right?
Yeah.
It's a flattening of a database of everything or many things that are available. But it changes our sense of time and experience of time. And I think the pandemic has made it even worse, obviously, during lockdown, how it felt like some sort of Groundhog Day.
Yeah, and you start kind of saying, what day is it? What month is it? When are we doing this?
It's almost like the last 2 years, 18 months were like just taken from us, right? It's like we jumped over that period of time.
Sure.
So I think that's...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that relates to my own work in the sense of wanting to do a slower kind of art practice and this other faster one, this sense of even the slow art practice of drawing and painting. If I get in the flow right, the whole afternoon will flash by and I'll be like, wow, where did the day go?
Of course.
Just totally got compressed, but yet it was a slow experience. It's just an interesting experience of time.
One thing I am kind of curious about as far as your own artwork goes and your own art output, is there, just strictly speaking capitalistically, is there a market for it? Or is it just kind of for personal interest and to share it with others and to have that experience of it being shared?
Well, I think the first thing I would mention is we're discussing two very different things. So we're not talking the art and the art making, we're talking the business of art or the industry, or a product in a capitalistic society where it's for sale.
Right.
I do sell work occasionally when I do put things up for sale in group shows and stuff like drawings or paintings or objects. Mm-hmm. I do not try to do that in any particular intention. The idea of making digital work, again, that's reproducible, NFTs are actually the opposite of what I am interested in the sense that when I make this digital object, it exists everywhere.
Right.
I send you a photograph. So the answer is no, I don't think there's a market, but NFTs, people would argue there could be if I want one. I made a conscious decision 20 years ago to not do that for political, social reasons.
Sure.
If I go to the Grand Canyon and I take a photograph of myself, a selfie at the Grand Canyon, and you and all my other friends are on Instagram, and I send you all that photograph, that moment, the time between my action, my documentation, and my sharing of it with all of my friends have compressed into a second at the speed of light over the internet.
Right.
30, 40, 50 years ago, you would take your 35 millimeter slides and you'd have to get it developed and you'd come to my house and I would bore you with 300 photos and slides and tell you about my
yes.
But it was all stretched, right?
Yeah.
So that sense of time is completely compressed with our mobile device. And the photo that I have on my phone that I just photographed is equal to the ones you all have. It is not any better or any different or any worse. It's equal. It exists everywhere on all of these hard drives. And to me, that's super magical and amazing. It's the opposite of making some piece of art that is unique. And again, this is back to Walter Benjamin. He uses the term an aura, right? What makes it unique? The provenance of that object. What makes the Mona Lisa different than the image on the poster or on the T-shirt or the coffee mug? Whether you've ever been to the Louvre or not, you know what it looks like, and we experience it in these different copies. I love the idea that the digital object can be copied without degradation, and yours is equal to mine. Why can't we all own that same piece of artwork?
Sure.
It's like the metaverse, or using Second Life as an example, almost 20 years ago. Why can't we all live on an island in my Second Life? Why do I have to spend money, Linden dollars, in Second Life to buy an island? Or why under Facebook's metaverse do I have to spend money? I want my digital life to not reproduce all the problems of my physical one. And an NFT, just a non-fungible token that adds that cryptographic bit to the digital object that makes it unique, is about scarcity and market and capitalism. And yes, people might experience that image on the wall behind what the image that you created. If it's a one of a kind, is it truly worth more? In the market, it might be, but why can't we all have it? Technically, we could. So it's about making the world that I want to live in, not be part of this system in some ways.
And I would imagine that when you teach, you talk to your students about the same thing.
Sure.
And
absolutely.
I didn't have a chance to look it up. What classes you're still teaching, even though you're interim director, you're still teaching, I would assume, right?
I do. This semester I taught more than I should have, actually. So I taught a history of new media course this semester. It's kind of a hybrid studies practice-based course.
Neat.
We basically go from the Italian futurists and the Dadists, jumping very quickly to World War II, and we go through the computer science of World War II to now. Computer science, the internet, all those kinds of ideas. We look at art history from the Dadists and the Italian futurists through a thread, not unlike what I described, through happenings and Fluxus and the software show. And we look at the economics and the social pressures that kind of put pressure on these developments, and how many times the computer scientists and the artists are working on similar concepts. They may not be aware of it. We might connect the development of the network with some of the ideas of John Cage using random chance in the class. And then ultimately trying to make sense of the present. We use a lot of primary sources for reading of that. And then I also have the students read the book that I mentioned, Lev Manovich's The Language of New Media. It's almost 20 years old, but he got so much right that it's still quite shocking in 2021. And that's an example. The other class that I've been teaching is we've been developing a brand new foundation sequence of courses for our first year students.
Okay.
In the School of Media Arts, and it's team taught, and that's another class that I'm teaching. And in this particular semester, it's a two semester sequence. I'm teaching drawing and collage and 2D design, real basic skills like that. In the spring, I'll do another module where I'll be doing performance and installation, but introducing Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, basic code and sensors to kind of get students to think about the live event, a performance versus a mediated event through the camera, and what do you gain, what do you lose?
Yeah.
Interactivity, the ability to give up agency as the artist to chance or to a viewer or participant to make choices with the art. So it's a lot of the same themes that are in my artwork that I already talked about that are being taught for this introductory year.
Interesting. And so what other class will you be teaching next semester aside from that?
Right. Next semester, I'll also be teaching a class that I'm also teaching now. I won't be teaching the History of New Media course. But, a forum in art and culture is just another class that students go to lots of arts events, and we discuss art and culture and connect the dots. The other kinds of classes I teach, I just don't teach as many as often, but in my rotation, I teach a general live art performance class. That's a full semester to kind of build on that. And sometimes when I've taught it, we'll do adaptation. We've adapted. One year I worked with a colleague in cinema studies faculty. We co-teach. And we did an adaptation of Kafka's Metamorphosis. Oh. So the student would do performance and think about that, but then do adaptation. Another one was Frankenstein. So we did Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and adapted that. I teach a generative art class that really is directly connected to my research. I have in the past taught interaction design and web design, which is much closer to a applied kind of traditional website, but I also teach networked art, where students, MFAs and undergrads who want to use the same code that I might teach for MS students to make a website, will just use the web as an art platform.
Nice.
How to produce that code, how to learn the code to make art, and then potentially other ways to use the network.
Awesome. We actually have a viewer who said a generative art class sounds super cool. So yeah, I'm sure it is.
Yeah, no, it can be really great. And what I love about teaching generative art, I taught it during when we went half semester under the pandemic. I was teaching generative art that semester. So half of it was face-to-face and half was online. And it was really fun because what I love about it is I don't teach code in particular. I introduce code, but you can make generative art out of anything. That's one of the things that the conference is so great about. So architects and designers and musicians all show up in Italy and discuss what is generative art. For my class, we really come to it like, for us, what is the definition of it? I could make a painting and let it sit outside in the weather and rain and fade and drip. And that's generative, giving up control to the weather.
Sure.
So students can make analog art in my generative art class, or they could make digital code-based art if they wish. And then in the pandemic, what was great, because we went over Zoom, there was a student, an MFA here in the college, that was interested in sound. He made all of this work by just hanging a microphone out his window and capturing the sounds of cars driving by very seldomly in the pandemic. And it became this beautiful image of the pandemic, of isolation, with this microphone sticking out of his window, and then the sounds that it generated through this code-based process. So it was a very effective class, I thought, during a pandemic, to think about those constraints and pressures that allow the generative art to develop.
So do you personally have any medium that you are partial to, where you kind of just keep going back to it, as far as anything aside from the generative art that you do? Is there any like hard set medium that you're partial to?
Well, I suppose the consistent one, and I don't know that it's because I'm partial, but would be drawing and charcoal on paper as a way in my process. Not all during my career have I produced finished drawings. That ebbs and flows, but I always draw, whether it's to generate ideas and to develop concepts. So that would be a consistent thing for 30 years. But I tend to change mediums when I get bored. To be honest, I feel like I get into bad habits or I become bored. I feel like I need to shake it up. So for example, I recently started doing woodcuts again the last couple of years, and I hadn't done that since I was in grad school the last time. But it's very much like coding in my mind. You remove material, so it's very sculptural and physical, and then you ink it up and you print a proof, and that's much like coding, where I can kind of tell what it's going to do, but I don't know exactly what kind of image it's going to produce. And so you run the code and you produce an artist proof. And then you go back to the code and you tweak it and you produce an artist proof. And so I really find that process, that slightly, the way I would categorize the mediums is which are direct and which are a little bit distant, rather than what medium are you working in, which one give you immediate feedback and which have a bit of a process. So theater is great, directing actors or adapting scripts, and you get feedback in rehearsal, but it isn't until the actual performance that you feel the audience feedback.
Right.
But it has different distances. Printmaking, lithography, or woodcuts, I've done a lot of. Those kind of things have a little distance, and so does code. But if I'm doing a drawing or a painting or something else, it's immediate. And so for me, it's back to that. It's back to that immediacy. And when do I want the distance, and when do I want that tactile immediacy?
So it has to do with what kind of feedback you're getting, at least.
Yeah, I think so. I think that when looking back sort of retrospectively, I wasn't conscious of this, but when you ask that question, I think that is the consistent divergence rather than a particular medium. The mediums can be categorized between its process, and I think I'm always shifting between those categories while also maybe shifting materials, but that's not nearly as important.
Okay.
So I like live performance in the sense of doing a live performance for an audience and getting that instant feedback. That's really wonderful.
Right. So if you If you meet anyone, as far as students go, who are interested in generative art but don't necessarily know what they want to do with it or where they want to go with it, do you have any kind of suggestions for folks if that's something they want to look into?
Well, yeah, I think, there are various people who have tried to write textbooks and things on it. I don't believe one really exists that I'm aware of. I think the question that I would just encourage any student to consider, I think one of the things that most people would agree upon is that generative art is a process that you somehow put into place and you give up some control. So to me, it's simply about control. We all pretend that we control everything when I actually believe we control very little. We all have various amounts of an appetite to giving up control. So for me, generative art raises questions of artistic intent, who's the audience, how much control or collaboration do you want to have? Do you see it as a collaboration? Do you see it, if you're directing, theater or film is a great example. It's collaborative art. You might say, well, that's a Hitchcock film, that's a David Lynch film, but clearly it takes a whole crew of people to produce that. Right. We frame it as if they're the artist. But it could also be much more collaborative. It could be John Cassavetes developing a script with the actors in more of a relationship of collaboration. So to me, generative art raises those artistic questions. So I think it's more about those questions than it being a style, because it can look very different. So the real answer to your question is, anyone interested in generative art, the question is, where do you see your role as the maker in the process, in collaboration with a material or a collaborator, in a process that you give up some amount of autonomy, some amount of control, so it becomes an autonomous process.
Got it.
That's
perfect. That's perfect. So we're gonna take a few more minutes. A couple things that I want to know before we sign off would be, are there any projects that you're going to be doing that are upcoming that you want people to know about?
I'm in a journal, a really interesting journal you'd be interested in your audience. It's called, you might know it, The New River. It's a journal at the University of Virginia, I believe, in Blacksburg. If you go to thenewriver.com, I think is the URL.
Okay.
Really interesting work. It's a digital literary journal, and I have some work shown there. The particular Cruft, the Milton's Bomb is there, and a lot of other good people in the show. Really interesting. So you can see that show now. Nothing that you can see, but I'll be doing performance at the Generative Art Conference in about a week.
Okay.
I'm doing a performance and also presenting a paper. And those are the two most recent things right now for the work.
Okay.
But you can go to the New River and see that. I'm excited with the people around me in the show are really good, and I think it's worth checking out.
For sure. Your website is also worth checking out. So if anybody wants to see more of your work, I definitely suggest that they go to robertspahr.com. You've got your work posted there. And I also suggest people read some of your writing, because your writing is very interesting.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
So
I have a new work on the homepage. I just did it about 2 days ago. A new
okay.
So
nice.
There you go.
Okay, yeah, so we've got something new to even look at. Then I also want to know if anyone has any questions about your classes, can they reach out to your SIU email?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Come to my office hours and talk to me and show me what you're working on. That would be ideal, but Zoom or an email would be great.
Okay, wonderful.
Always interested, yeah, for sure.
Well, that about does it for me. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you very much for the work that you're doing for SIU. Thank you for your interesting ideas and bringing some new media to the forefront. You know, getting people involved in generative art. It's definitely it's new and interesting, and I'm sure there's a lot more that can be done with it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. This has been fun.
Oh, of course, yes. Well, you have a lovely evening, and I'm sure we'll see each other at some point, possibly in person on campus somewhere.
I hope so. Okay, great.
Thank you very much. You have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.